We'll go ahead and get started. So today we have our own certified Petra coach, Patrick Burke, with us. Patrick has over 16 years of experience in finance, law, and entrepreneurship. He earned degrees from Vanderbilt University and spent time in Wall Street law firms and investment banks. He then founded a restaurant group, washing dishes and bussing tables while leading his diverse team to multi-location hospitality group with millions in annual revenues. In over a decade in the restaurant business, he has had the opportunity to recruit, train, and coach over 1,000 employees. Patrick has also been applying psychology-based leadership tactics in his life and career for years. His experience in this area comes from 12 years growing a restaurant group, having hired and coached over 1,000 employees total, requiring intensive people and management skills, a degree in psychology from Vanderbilt University, intensive study of parenting styles and how they correlate with leadership, and being married to a gifted marriage and family therapist. In this webinar, Patrick will introduce a variety of psychological principles that will boost your self-awareness, growth, and in turn, your leadership. We also have a special guest, Kristen McLean, with us from the Vivid Ink company. Kristen and her team transform the spoken word into lasting and actionable works of art. So in your recap, you'll all have a really beautiful and unique drawing of today's webinar as well. And then one last reminder that this is an interactive session. So if you look at the bottom of your screen, you'll see a chat button and a Q&A button. We encourage you to use those throughout any time you have a question or comment for Patrick. So without further ado, Patrick, take it away.
Excellent. Thank you, Janelle. I'm excited to see the image of this that'll come out. I've never seen that before. So today's topic is obviously called Emotional Agility, Transformative Leadership by Engaging the Whole Person. So today's webinar is likely to read more like a tool belt of sorts. I've got a little image of a tool belt. So imagine, this is going to be like I'm putting a tool belt on you and I'm kind of in rapid fire telling you like, this is a screwdriver, this is a hammer, this is a pair of pliers, this is a measuring tape. So there's going to be a lot of information in this talk today. So it is going to be recorded for you to go back and watch at a later date if you want to. Because we are going to be moving pretty quickly to cover a lot of ground. So with that, we will get moving. So the problem today for us as leaders is that we are stuck in an outdated mindset. And a lot of it is rooted in this concept of what I call professionalism in quotes, or armor, which is a term I started using a long time ago. And Brene Brown uses this term as well. So we'll kind of talk a lot about that. The pandemic and remote work has exposed rifts in teams and organizations. And really what that's about is a lack of trust and collaboration. That's mostly what this battle over returning to work is about trust or a lack thereof. I gave this topic first in April and I've updated it since then. And at that point I said, the mental pandemic, and I put in brackets, has been here. And it was really here exactly at the same time that the health pandemic was in 2020. It's really coming out in a lot of ways now. Yet in most of the business community aren't seeking or generating actionable ideas about how to handle that. And so, an injection of hope, not play on words there, as we're seeing those who've placed their hope in the vaccine getting us back to normal. We're not going back to normal. So we as leaders, we need to, if you haven't arrived at that conclusion, you need to get there today. Prior to the pandemic, depression was the #1 cause of disability globally from the World Health Organization. Depression and anxiety, we are all individually and collectively kind of untethered as a society. Addiction is skyrocketing. As Janelle mentioned, my wife is a marriage and family therapist. She's in her practice, she's seeing just an insane demand because people are hurting and they need help. And it's really, there's a lot going on below the surface. Again, I had this in April, the arrival of vaccines, it doesn't push out and kind of, returning to everybody's grasping for normal again, doesn't push out what's happened to people. And that there's been loss, there's been health loss and death, there's been loss of previous routines, loss of life as we knew it. And one key as a leader is making space for it, first in yourself and moving forward. It's both and. Because as I mentioned before, there will not be a return to normal. So if I said to you, I think we would all agree as leaders, certainly if you're on this webinar, you're interested in growing your organization. If I said to you, our goal is to have a culture with stronger collaboration, less stress, better morale, where people bounce back quicker, I think we would all agree that that would be a great outcome for our organizations. This description is word for word from a Harvard Business Review article based on research of empathic workplaces, or workplaces that have a high degree of empathic behavior that exemplifies a lot of empathy. So really, as a leader today, we have two paths that we can go down. Okay. The first one is, let's call this the superhero path, or the Clint Eastwood path, or the John Wayne, or, there's a lot of Americanism ideals, where we have our professional armor on. We show up to work as a leader. We say, I have the plan, or worse, we say, I'm in charge. And that's a title leader. You don't want to be that. Really, if we're taking this approach and we're turning down the volume on our own feelings, we are inherently limiting the ability to recognize, enter into, and be present with other people's feelings. As entrepreneurs, for those of you who have started a company and you're kind of in that world, we're especially vulnerable to these narratives of resilience and mental toughness are counterintuitively harmful to us. And then you combine this with the inherent loneliness of running a business, not during a pandemic, and you have kind of a recipe for disaster. So I'm going to keep going down this first path. It's pretty obvious I don't believe in and that we should continue in that first path, but we really need to examine where we are first and how did we get here. And so, this idea that hard skills in terms of, financial analysis and programming, or, business strategy, or whatever it is, are better than or greater than soft skills. That maybe the pandemic has really accelerated the trend that's exposing that as a flawed assumption. The way we got here, for background, was in the Industrial Revolution, when it became time to do formal schooling. People moved off of farms, they moved into cities and to go to school, which was, by the way, only for males at the time. Then they would be teaching formal lessons. So anything not easy to tabulate, that wasn't scientific or mathematical, or perhaps was felt a little illogical, was more or less left to women. And psychology as a social science really didn't take off until the 1960s. It really didn't make its way into management science until the 1970s or 80s. And so it's taken, really half a century to acknowledge that these concepts are very, very important. It's fine. I'm fine. You're fine. It's going to be fine. So when we say that to ourselves, when we hear that as leaders in our workplaces, if somebody's saying that shuts out the possibility of further contemplation. Yet this is how most people show up to work every day, because of their leaders. But don't be fooled. All your people can smell the smoke. They're just looking out for themselves and putting up a front. So this brings us to the concept of what toxic positivity is. And again, it goes to this counterintuitive idea that forced positivity actually undermines resilience. So toxic positivity, let's talk about what it is and what it isn't. Toxic positivity can be described as the idea that the best or only way to cope with a bad situation is to put a positive spin on it. Now, cultivating a positive mindset is a powerful coping mechanism, but doing this is not. People who are genuinely upbeat or effusive are not the issue here. The issue is when people are forced to seem or be positive in a situation where all the signs of the situation point to that it would not be natural to be positive about it. That's when we get real problems from this. Key takeaway here is, how, and I'm saying, to this to you individually, and also as a leader, to look for this in your people, in your world, how you feel is valid, because it's your experience. And so the key here is, how can this be held alongside other coping mechanisms, such as gratefulness or resourcefulness amidst challenges? It's both and. Gratefulness and resourcefulness, and I'm feeling sad about this, I'm feeling discouraged about this, whatever it is. The language that you use with yourself and with others is critical, and we'll talk more about that. Research shows that people who tend not to judge their feelings as either good or bad, and not put distance between themselves and the bad ones, have better health. And I don't just mean mental health. So research of 1,300 adults showed that habitually avoiding acknowledging challenging emotions can actually damage physical health. This is from the Journal of Personal Social Psychology in December 2018. So conversely, habitual acceptance of challenging emotions produced lower negative emotional responses to a standardized stressor in these studies. bring you to the first book alert of many that you'll have in this webinar of The Body Keeps the Score. So released in 2014, this book has surged in popularity, and as of October 10th was #1 on the New York Times bestseller list for 34 weeks straight. That is not a coincidence of what we're seeing in our culture. This book is all about how if you aren't handling and tackling and really developing in your emotional agility, your body will keep the score and it will catch up to you in terms of physical health. Quick ideas on how do we reduce toxic positivity. So one exercise you can do is to pull out a blank sheet of paper and find some space in your day and write down what you feel as if nobody's looking. Another thing you can do is we often want people to set goals of behavior, not feelings. So for example, I want to feel happy, I want to have more energy, I want to feel a certain way. Well then, okay, let's set our goals toward the behaviors and things that are going to set us up to feel that way. I gave another talk recently where we described happiness is actually an outcome. You have to sow what you sow and reap your way into happiness by virtue of the behaviors and really the daily habits in your life. Also a key distinction, making the best of a situation is not the same as toxic positivity. Making the best of a situation can be resourcefulness, can be gratefulness. The key is that both and holding space for, hey, this is a tough situation and I feel these things about it, and having that moment and then choosing moving forward. It's going to be a lot of references to Simon Sinek in here. I'm a huge fan of his, but he would say we are still suffering from the side effects of business theories of the 80s and the 90s. He put words to something I'd realized out in the field because I went straight from business school into opening my own restaurant company and going into that and realized that a lot of the theoretical things that they taught you were bad for people, as he says, and bad for business. So as one example, the concept of shareholder supremacy, where everything, the most important thing is shareholder supremacy. We see that some of the best companies are in our midst, Apple, Southwest, improving beyond that. But this is akin to attempting to win a football game by prioritizing the fans over the team on the field. So it's not going to work out very well. When we as leaders are creating organizations where the conditions are wrong, our people are then forced to expend their own resources, particularly emotional resources, to protect themselves from each other. And these conditions inherently weaken the organization. Great book on this topic is Humanocracy by Gary Hamel. He talks a lot about bureaucracy versus humanocracy and empowerment and a lot of things that play that forward. And so from this, if you are honest with yourself and you're running an organization that's focused on productivity with the idea that humans are machines, it's profoundly dehumanizing. And your company is going to fall victim to what we're seeing right now, which is the Great Resignation, where either companies are getting separated very quickly into two buckets. Either it's attraction and people are attracted to your culture and they want to come there, or it's attrition and people want to leave there and get out of there because now people have more choice. It's a workers' market, not an employer's market, and so you really need to be honest about what kind of culture are you cultivating. And so we must first start by seeing our teammates as humans who need to be led and inspired, not managed. And by all means, avoid the term human capital. People are not meant to be spent by the organization. So we're still in that number. We had two paths to go down. We can either choose the status quo and stay where we've been. I would argue this is your #1 leadership opportunity to return to better. Conversely, when the conditions are right that we've created in our organizations, people will combine their efforts. They will work tirelessly to face dangers outside the organization and find opportunity. And dangers in our modern world can include threats to the organization, economic conditions, global pandemics, household and corporate debt levels, all kinds of things. So it's our job as leaders to make the right conditions. As Simon Sinek would say, leading is not being in charge, but taking care of those in our charge. One of the sayings I say all the time with the CEOs that I work with is that people bring their whole selves to work. All their as they bring their dad hat, they bring their mom hat, their brother, sister, all the roles that they play, like they bring their whole selves to work. They don't just show up with their professional armor on and I'm ready to be my work, Patrick, and I'm gonna forget everything that's going on in my life when I walk through the doors. That's not how it works. And in Brene Brown's book, there's a quote that says, I'm a very logical CEO. And she says, well, that's like saying I'm a CEO and I choose to leave my left hand at home. None of us as leaders show up at work that way either. So we really need to understand the whole person and not be afraid to lead the whole person either. So the second path is that we can grow in our own emotional agility as leaders to create an empathic culture in our organizations. And so this is where, one of greater connection in our organizations, where there's safety, where people can be known. It cultivates widespread resiliency, emotional resiliency, and therefore emotionally agile people then make emotionally agile and agile organizations. So let's talk for a minute about emotional agility versus emotional fragility. Book alert again, Dr. Susan David wrote a great book on emotional agility. She's also got several great podcasts and interviews with Brene Brown. They're fantastic. But this challenge that leaders are facing is how to hold space in our environments for the people that we're leading when we still have to get things done. And it's that balance of the work and the work of the people. As people, as parents and leaders, we need to grow in our emotional agility, because this myth that's been propagated for decades, if not centuries, is that pretending we're not, this is again, picture that superhero leader, pretending we're not feeling actually leads to fragility. Because when we push aside difficult realities, fear often builds on the perimeter of our minds, and then I put in parentheses on our bodies, because the body keeps the score. And this happens in our teammates also, is that it really blocks us from doing our best work and offering our highest contributions. Our own psychological well-being depends on the concept of integration. So Latin root of integrare is to make whole. And so, segmentation, the organization is simply a reflection of the individuals inside of it. So segmentation versus integration, this goes back to that. People bring their whole selves to work versus kind of compartmentalization of things. And so if individuals are forced to compartmentalize because they can't be seen at work, they can't show up in their whole selves, it's going to have an impact on what they bring. And you're going to have a very segmented organization instead of one that it's more integrated. And the answer is in emotional agility, which really starts with ourselves first, so we can be healthy with each other. So we all have thoughts, feelings, emotions throughout the day, and the way that we deal with them drives everything. It drives how we parent, how we lead, how we love. There's this great expression from Susan David's book, Emotional Agility. She's from South Africa, and there's this greeting in South Africa called sawubona. And instead of saying like, hey, how are you? What this means is I see you, and by seeing you, I bring you into being, which is just a beautiful description of, of what's possible with humans in each other as we have interactions during the day, versus sometimes in our culture, there's often like, how are you? But I really don't care, which is a big distinction between those two. Brene Brown's top question in 2020 to the CEOs she worked with was, do your people feel seen? So what are these signposts about myself and others? Like, what are they telling me? Say like being curious about emotions, your own first and other people, both quote positive and quote negative. There really are not positive or negative emotions. It's just that that's what our culture has taught people to think. The question is like, what are these signposts telling me about myself? What are these telling me about others? Curiosity is a corner about other people, genuinely is a cornerstone of emotional agility and empathy. Emotions are data, they're not directives. So what I mean by that is that they are again holding a little bit of space of like, okay, I'm noticing I'm feeling this emotion, and instead of going immediately to action about it, sometimes it's best to identify what it is, hold a little space for it before we move on to the next thing. Charles Darwin said, emotions are fundamental to our adaptation. And Jim Collins has recognized that we fundamentally operate, even in business, at the level of emotion, not thoughts and analysis. So with that, we'll get into some tools for greater emotional agility. So one of these, this is a basic one in the tool belt called reflection and validation. Okay, so you've probably encountered this before. reflection, it's two parts. Reflection is repeating what you've heard to confirm understanding. So again, going back to Savavana, like that you see the other person. So you're saying, if I'm hearing you correctly, what you're saying is this. You're repeating back to them to make sure that they feel heard and understood. That's a ground level. That's the first part. The second part is often the harder part, which is validation means accepting that what they have said is valid for them, even if we don't agree with them. And so we're focusing on the emotional content of a statement or a conversation, not the details. Okay, this is the harder part. And so, I'll get into like kind of a role play about how that works with children as an example in a minute. Both and is a really important concept. By this, for give you an example of this, the birds are chirping and the sky is blue and the forest is on fire at the same time. That's a graphic example. And we see a lot of that in our culture every day. We see examples of beauty and kindness in people, and we also see examples of tragedy and harm and awful things as well. And recognizing that this is happening is a key part of the human experience, and that relates to emotional agility as well. The unwillingness to embrace both of the beauty and the tragedy that lives within us is a big part of what leads to emotional rigidity. Brene Brown says tough emotions are part of our contract with life. We don't get to raise a family, pursue successful careers, grow a business, or really achieve anything that's worthwhile without experiencing tough emotions. Let's talk a minute about emotional granularity and the power of linguistics. And this is a huge growth area for me personally. I'm still in this, definitely still in this journey of improvement, but also for everybody I work with, is that the language we have, when we paint in really broad strokes, it doesn't help us. Our minds and bodies don't really know how to handle. For example, like I'm stressed, I'm busy, when you say stress, that captures a lot. So really, there's a lot of tools we can use. We'll get to these in a moment, but be aware of the specificity or lack thereof of your language in talking about your emotions and what that's saying. And so I want you to grow after today in getting more granular. Viktor Frankl was famous Austrian Holocaust survivor, and he became a psychologist. He studied in America after that. He's a famous psychologist. And let's get this beautiful quote: between stimulus and response, sorry, my computer had to pop up. Between stimulus and response, there is a space. In that space is our power to choose our response. In our response lies our growth and our freedom. He would say this allows for agency, a person's capacity to breathe into the feelings versus, a victim mentality. And a lot of the things that he wrote about, including this and other things, are what helped him survive the Holocaust, because they couldn't take his thoughts. They couldn't take, they took everything else and his clothing and everything, but they could not take his thoughts. So specificity of language. I am sad versus I'm noticing I'm feeling sad. What's the difference between those two? So I am sad it can at its worst be like I'm identifying as like I am sad. It's like I am the personification of sadness, versus the very subtle difference of I'm noticing I'm feeling sad. It puts a little bit of that space that Viktor Frankl talked about of between you and your emotion. And what we find with emotional rigidity, there's no space between the stimulus and the response. So I'm angry and I lash out, and it's just boom, boom, happens really quickly. Agility is okay. I can show up to that difficult feeling. I can stop resisting about whether to show up or not, because I'm deciding I want to grow in this area. So I'm going to stop the resistant posture of I don't want to feel any of the negative or challenging emotions, and I'm going to stop resisting. I'm noticing I'm feeling sad. So that keyword of like I'm noticing I'm feeling fill in the blank. Write that down. That's a very simple tool, along with reflection and validation, you can use to start growing in your emotional granularity with your words, and to give yourself a little bit of that moment of contemplation. Another great tool is feelings charts. This is something we've been using in our household for years. There are a variety of them out there. And so, I'll show you a couple examples in a minute. Research shows that, there's a correlation between children, even at ages 2 and 3, who can label their emotions and their capacity for delayed gratification, which is actually a really important cornerstone of what becomes grit which is what Carol Dweck and other people have written about that growth mindset, which is grounded in grit, starts with the ability to handle delayed gratification. Okay, so and that's a huge thing. I mean, we've seen that in our children as well. So this is a feelings chart from I believe this one is from The Voice of the Heart by Chip Dodd. It's a book that's more popular in therapy circles, but you can see like there's really, he would say there's like 8 core feelings, anger, fear, loneliness, guilt, shame. And he describes, this is what I love, the difference between unhealthy and healthy. Like, so let's take shame, for example. Like that's something I've struggled with over the years. And so shame, unhealthy is, inadequacy, and, it's really it's a toxic identity, versus healthy shame is like something, something that I've, done wrong. And so I feel humility about this. I am a broken person, and humility is an appropriate posture. So that's an adult feelings chart. Here's another one example from Vanderbilt Behavioral Health here in Nashville, and it's got about 20 different feelings on there. And this is one they can use with kids as well. But it really, again, we need help in this because a lot of this is new for a lot of us. And feelings charts are a really great, very simple way to grow in your emotional aptitude and your emotional agility. This is one that we use with our kids at home. And so it's kind of funny, but I feel guilty, I feel confused, I feel embarrassed, I feel disappointed, I'm feeling hopeful. So we go beyond happy or sad. Way too often in our culture, we want to bring things down to a very kind of like binary. It's either good or bad. It's either positive or negative. But that's not how we are as people. We're much more capable of a spectrum of emotions. And so let's have the right words for that. And as you grow in that way, it'll be very, very helpful as a leader. This is one that's sure to offend most of the parents on the call, but I'm going to drop it anyways. So, and this it goes back to our reflection and validation. This is where I'm going to kind of do a role play with a kid. So let's take, for example, like a really upset kid. The kid is crying, they're screaming, they're throwing a tantrum, right? Or there's something's happening. If you're a parent, you've been on the playground, like this, and you've seen this, and parent comes up to the kid and the kid's just screaming, and the parent says, you're okay, or the kid falls and like hurts himself even, and says, and the parent's like, you're okay. The kid is not okay. They are screaming, they are crying, they are telling you with all of the tools that they have that they are not okay. And I want you to try this as a parent the next time you encounter this, is instead of saying you're okay, say you're really mad. I see how mad you are. Like you really get down to their level and you reflect back to them like, I see how mad you are. Yes, I'm mad. And this is something that I've had to grow in a lot as a parent, because I wanted to come down hard. I wanted to come down on the discipline side of things. And my wife, who's the brilliant one in this category, really coached me on this and said, first, validate their feelings. It does not mean that you're necessarily going to give in or go along with it, but validation of that feelings, you'd be shocked to see their difference in response of a child versus saying they're okay. Same thing happens with grownups, right? Imagine you're in a conflict at work and you're frustrated about it, you're upset, and your boss just said, you're okay, and just sort of denied your feelings. How much more frustrated would you be? Or same thing with your spouse, your partner, if you're in a fight and they just, you're okay. How unseen do you feel in that moment? So again, that goes back to reflection and validation. Again, another tool in the tool belt, something to consider, and we're not going to cover it in depth today, but to read more about, is the idea of attachment theory and secure base. So with children, again, and leadership parenting, same thing. Simon Sinek you can Google a lot about that as well. But let's say a child starts out, they start out with their parent, then they go out and they come back. They go out and they come back. This starts as when they toddle and they start toddling, they go 5-6 feet and then they come back. Then they get a little older, 3-4, then might go 50 feet and come back. Then they go to high school and college and they study abroad and then they might come back. So it just gets bigger and bigger. The key is, the idea of a secure base is that, do they feel safe with their parent to be seen? And there's an analogy here for work, and I've seen this in my restaurant world, where we have a lot of team members in the restaurant industry that are really hurting, and they're broken. They for whatever reason, the restaurant industry it kind of collects folks who have had a rough go of it in life a lot of time, and often they don't have a great family situation. And I have seen, and this was sort of unintentional in the beginning, and then I became more aware of it as the years went on, that by creating a safe and stable environment in the workplace. Like we became their secure base, and people would feel safe to show up, and like people just kind of keep coming back to our employment. They might go out and work for another restaurant and be like, yeah, the grass wasn't greener, and they're going to come back in our orbit, often because of this, not because of compensation or anything else like that, but because they felt attached. They had that secure base, organizationally. So this idea is definitely something to research further, because, again, like on the parenting side, that child who is able to develop a sense of and recognize their emotions, and that these emotions aren't going to kill me, and they become comfortable with them, that leads to resiliency. And it's the same thing in grownups. Simon Sinek again writes, creating trust and safety means taking on big responsibility. He's got a book called Great Leaders Make People Feel Safe. And that, for the last year and a half, that's a lot of times that's meant physically safe. We want people to feel physically safe with respect to COVID coming to work. So that took on new meaning in the last 18 months. And it also means emotionally safe. And do people feel safe and to show up and feel known to a reasonable degree, and this is a journey. For every culture is different. But that's a big part of it. So let's talk about compassion and self-compassion. So this is a second major thrust of how Susan David describes emotional agility, is starting with ourselves, having compassion and for others, and self-compassion. In terms of accessing this, she talks about identifying your 5-year-old self. She talks a lot about tactile and heart and touch, and that, we are human and we are more than our doing. And that there's been a lack of handshakes and hugs and things like that we need in the pandemic. And so understanding and accessing the compassion for yourself and the way you feel is an important part of agility, so you can have compassion for other people. And that's really one of the vehicles to safely explore our emotions. This is one of the things that I encounter a lot. We don't do this full topic with leaders all the time, but I see this leaders are scared to wade into the muck and wade into the emotional waters with team members, because they're already contemplating what's called compassion fatigue. So I don't want to be too compassionate, because it might result in compassionate fatigue, or it'll open the floodgates. And I just want to. It feels safer to just put on the professional armor and hide behind that. But I'm here to tell you that that's not going to work going forward. And as leaders, we have to grow our compassion muscles, so that it isn't as hard, and grow our cultures so that this is more normal. So at this point, I do have a quick video I'm going to share that really drives this point home.
So what is empathy, and why is it very different than sympathy? Empathy fuels connection. Sympathy drives disconnection. Empathy, it's very interesting. Teresa Wiseman is a nursing scholar who studied professions, very diverse professions where empathy is relevant, and came up with 4 qualities of empathy. Perspective taking, the ability to take the perspective of another person or recognize their perspective as their truth. Staying out of judgment, not easy when you enjoy it as much as most of us do. Recognizing emotion in other people and then communicating that. Empathy is feeling with people. And to me, I always think of empathy as this kind of sacred space when someone's kind of in a deep hole and they shout out from the bottom and they say, I'm stuck, it's dark, I'm overwhelmed. And then we look and we say, hey, I'm down. I know what it's like down here, and you're not alone. Sympathy is, ooh, it's bad, no, you want a sandwich? Empathy is a choice, and it's a vulnerable choice, because in order to connect with you, I have to connect with something in myself that knows that feeling. Rarely, if ever, does an empathic response begin with at least. And we do it all the time, because you know what? Someone just shared something with us that's incredibly painful, and we're trying to silver lining it. I don't think that's a verb, but I'm using it as one. We're trying to put the silver lining around it. So I had a miscarriage. At least you know you can get pregnant. I think my marriage is falling apart. At least you have a marriage. John's getting kicked out of school. At least Sarah is an A student. But one of the things we do sometimes in the face of very difficult conversations is we try to make things better. If I share something with you that's very difficult, I'd rather you say, I don't even know what to say right now. I'm just so glad you told me. Because the truth is, rarely can a response make something better. What makes something better is connection.
So many things from that video. Oop, I don't need to stop it. So many things from that video. So when Brene Brown first released that, it was 2014. And I remember my wife and I watched it around that time. She had a friend from Houston who was one of her students, and she was still teaching. And I want to go so far as to simplify. She said, rarely, if ever, does empathy start with at least. I'm going to simplify it for your memorization and just say empathy never starts with at least. And again, this is one of the most actionable things that you could take out of today. Empathy never starts with at least. This is something that our culture really does very poorly, is that everyone is attempting to silver line something or find the positive, put the spin on the positive. This is honestly this is a big root of toxic positivity. So she wrote, empathy is feeling with other people. It relates to perspective taking, staying out of judgment, recognizing emotion, which relates to emotional agility. So, but just remember and write that down. Empathy never starts with at least. This is the image I want you to have in your mind, as opposed to the Superman image at the top of the deck. This is what courage and leadership really looks like. It's wading through the mud together. There's not somebody who's clearly in front or clearly behind, and they're all just in it together. And it's messy, and they're not sure exactly what's going to happen. And that's what it takes real courage for that. It's easier to posture and show like you've got all the answers. But this courage is this third main facet of emotional agility, as described by Susan David. And really, this is the image I want you to have, not the superhero who has it all, quote unquote, together. Susan David writes, discomfort is the price of admission to a meaningful life. One of my other favorite quotes from Tim Ferriss and 4-Hour Workweek is he writes, a person's success in life can usually be measured by the number of uncomfortable conversations he or she is willing to have. And so this is something, again, to skill up in as leaders. I have found courage is the leader who says, I don't have all the answers. But someone who can really, because they've built the relationships over time, can say, instead of trust my map, I have all the answers, I know the route, trust my values, trust my compass. And this is kind of, to just borrow a personal example from how I steered the restaurants through COVID. Obviously, it was a very challenging experience, and there was no answers. None of us had faced this before. There was no white paper or webinar that was going to give you the playbook for this. So almost every week, or sometimes multiple times a week, it came down to just talking with the team, saying, "Hey, this is what I know. This is what I know now, and when I find out more, I will let you know." And I found that really it was a lot of the foundation and emotional agility we developed as a team, and culture and relationships that got us through that, because we all knew that we could trust that we didn't know where we were going, but we were going there together. And we had our values established, and so we knew the compass was there. So as leaders, we need empathy and high emotional regulation skills of our own. And so very much like leadership, empathy is not an inherent trait that we're born with this much or this much, but it's one that can be learned, grown, and practiced. So in our organizations, empathy often belongs sometimes to a quiet majority. So there's always some individuals that are always acting kindly. And as we're looking to grow empathy in our organizations, we want to be aware of phantom norms, which are behaviors that seem to be dominant just because a few prominent or loud individuals just. Instead, we can practice something called foregrounding, which is recognition or maybe even incentivization. So So employees can see the presence of empathy being celebrated, and this can turn up the volume on a positive norm. You can also identify connectors, people who can create cohesion by leading with empathy, and these folks can help the charge. As leaders, and we've already talked about language and emotional granularity. The language we use as leaders, I cannot overemphasize this enough, is very, very important. Carelessness or sloppiness in what we say can be very detrimental or damaging to people that are in our care, and therefore culture. So language and being, we're all going to have slip ups, but as leaders, this is really where we need to skill up at the language we have, the understanding we have of self-awareness, and how we lead ourselves first, and how we use language and the specificity we have, so that we're very careful. And I don't mean careful and guarded in an HR legal kind of way. I mean careful in a stewardship, leadership, curiosity and genuine caring for other people kind of way. You do not get an agile organization without agile people. So that's why we need more emotional agility. And so, as we begin to summarize, so much of what we talk about today is the power of yes and, the power of straddling the tension of opposites. Carl Jung wrote that paradox comes closer than anything else to explain the real human experience. And so I will close our talk and open up for questions. And there's been a ton of resources here that Janelle and our Petra team can compile and send afterwards, including Dare to Lead by Brene Brown, the Emotional Agility book by Susan David, the book by Chip Dodd, and several others from there. So with that, Janelle, we can go to any questions that we have.
All right, nothing yet, but if anyone has a question, you can type it in the chat box below. Okay, well, thank you all so much for attending. You will receive a recap in the next 24 hours, including the resources mentioned and a link to rewatch or share this webinar. Be sure to check out petracoach.com and click on our events tab to see all of our other upcoming workshops and webinars. And you can also view some of our previous ones. And as always, if you have any further questions or we can provide some additional help for your organization, reach out to us at info@petracoach.com. Patrick, thank you so much for being with us today.
Okay, thanks, Janelle.